The thing I keep coming back to, the detail that still wakes me up sometimes at 2 in the morning, is the grin. Not what he said, not what he wanted from us. Not even the fact that he'd been in those woods without a headlamp, in the dark, on a trail that went nowhere near civilization. The grin. My brother Jason and I had moved to Colorado a couple of years before this happened. We both loved the mountains. We'd talked about living near them our whole lives, the way some people talk about someday owning a boat or retiring somewhere warm. When we finally made it out there, we went cheap and split the rent on a townhome just outside Denver. It was a compromise, but it worked. The mountains were 15 minutes away on a clear day. Some mornings I'd drink my coffee and just stare at the range through the kitchen window, like I still couldn't believe we'd actually done it. The one problem with living that close to the mountains is that everyone else wants to be there too. The trails we used most were packed on weekends. You'd get out there hoping for quiet, for that feeling of being small and alone and part of something ancient. And instead you'd find families with strollers and Instagram photographers setting up tripods in the middle of the trail. It wasn't what either of us wanted, so Jason started planning. He spent a few weeks mapping out a 3-day backpacking route that would take us far enough from the main trailheads that we'd actually be alone. He found a campsite he'd read about in an old hiking forum, a flat ledge about 3/4 of the way up a particular mountain with a view of the valley below that people called one of the best in the state. The permits were available. The trail wasn't popular. He called it our reward for moving halfway across the country. I remember the morning we left. It was early fall, and the air had that sharp, clean coldness to it that you only get at altitude. We packed the night before, bear canister, freeze-dried meals, water filter, the whole setup. We were in good spirits the entire drive to the trailhead. When we pulled into the parking area and killed the engine, I noticed there was only one other vehicle there. An old SUV, dusty and dark, parked at the far end of the lot. The kind of car that looked like it had driven a long way through unpaved roads and wasn't apologizing for it. We glanced at it, figured there was one other hiker on the trail somewhere ahead of us, and that was that. With a trail that remote, one other person felt like nothing. The first day was 8 miles. Most of it flat until the last stretch where the trail pushed sharply upward along the mountainside. It was harder than I'd expected. My pack felt good for the first 6 miles, and then felt like a wet sandbag for the last 2. But when we finally cleared the tree line and found that flat ledge Jason had read about, everything else fell away. The valley spread out below us, golden and enormous in the late afternoon light. I stood there for a minute without saying anything. Jason was grinning. He'd earned that grin. We set up our tents side by side, gathered stones for a fire ring, and built a small fire as the sun finished dropping behind the peaks. We ate, we talked, we did the thing you come all the way out here to do, which is sit in the dark with someone you trust and say things you wouldn't say anywhere else. I don't know how long we'd been sitting there when we heard it. Footsteps on the trail below us, coming up. We both went quiet at the same time. I remember the fire crackling and the way it suddenly seemed very loud against everything else going silent. The footsteps were slow and steady, not hurried, not lost, deliberate. A minute later, the man walked out of the dark and into the edge of our firelight. He was average height, average build. He could have been anyone, but he wasn't wearing a headlamp. Every hiker knows you don't move on a mountain trail at night without a light source. It's not a rule someone teaches you. It's just something you understand because the alternative is stepping off a cliff. This man had walked up a dark mountain without any light at all, and he was smiling, not a friendly smile, not the trail greeting you give a stranger, that quick nod and grin that says we're both just people who like being outside, have a good hike. This was different. It was wide and still, and it didn't reach his eyes, and it didn't change, not once, for the entire time he stood in our camp. Jason stood up. He's always been the one who does that, just puts himself between whatever the situation is and me, without making a thing of it. "Hey, do you need something?" The man looked at Jason, then he looked at me. The smile stayed exactly where it was. He said he was a park ranger. He said he'd been following our trail and that this section of the mountain was closed for the season. He told us we needed to pack up immediately and follow him back down to the trailhead. The thing is, we knew the park wasn't closed. We had permits, state issued, applied for online, printed and folded into the top pocket of my pack. We'd checked and double-checked before we left. And beyond the paperwork, real park rangers don't show up on backcountry trails at night with no equipment, no uniform, no vehicle access to where we were standing. Jason said, "We have permits. The park is open." The man's smile didn't move. He said it again, that we needed to leave right now, that we needed to pack up everything and follow him, that he would lead us out. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't exactly fear. It was something quieter and colder than fear. It was the particular sensation of your body understanding something before your brain catches up. Every hair on my arms was standing. My chest felt tight in a way it hadn't during the 8-mile uphill hike. Some part of me that is older than rational thought was saying, "Do not go anywhere with this person." Jason said very clearly, "We're not going anywhere. We're staying here." For a long moment the man just stood there at the edge of the firelight, smiling. Then he turned around and walked back down into the dark. No headlamp, no sound after about 30 seconds. Just gone, swallowed up by the mountain. We didn't sleep that night. We kept the fire burning as high as we dared, and we sat with our backs to it so we could watch the darkness. Every sound on the mountain, every branch, every shift of wind, every creak of the pines became something to analyze and catalog and track. We talked sometimes in low voices about nothing important, just to keep the silence from getting too complete. A few times I thought I heard footsteps below us on the trail. I couldn't be sure. The mountain has sounds of its own. When the sun came up, we broke camp faster than we ever had. We were moving before the light was fully there, hiking down with our headlamps on, even in the growing dawn. We said almost nothing to each other the whole way down. When we reached the parking lot, the dusty SUV was still there. We drove home and filed a report with the local police. They took the information, told us they'd look into it, and as far as I know, they found nothing. No reports of anyone matching that description. No explanation for what he was doing on that mountain in the dark. And somewhere, still parked at that trailhead when we left, was the car that had driven him there. We never found out who he was. We never found out what happened to the other hiker who'd left their car at the trailhead that morning. I still think about that SUV. The way it was just sitting there in the morning light, looking like it had always been there and always would be. And I think about what would have happened if we'd said yes. If we'd packed up our tents and put out our fire and followed that grinning man down the dark side of a mountain in the middle of the night. I don't go backpacking alone anymore. Jason and I still go. But we go together, and we always tell someone exactly where we'll be and exactly when we'll be back. We got permits again the following year, different trail. I enjoyed every minute of it, but I still don't sleep as deeply out there as I used to. There was a moment that night when I realized I had no idea which way he was facing. That detail sounds small. It isn't. Because if he was facing away from me, he was just a man standing in the dark for reasons I couldn't explain. And if he was facing toward me, if he had been standing 20 feet from my tent, perfectly still and completely silent for 15 minutes, staring directly at me, that was something else entirely. By the time he walked away, and I finally understood which one it was, I had already been sitting there with a pocket knife in my hand for what felt like a long time. I used to camp with friends. In college, we'd load up someone's car with gear and cheap food and spend weekends at a spot we'd found a couple hours from campus. It was remote enough to feel like an escape and easy enough to reach that we actually went. We went a lot. Some of my best memories from those years are from that campsite. But then we graduated, and people scattered and schedules filled up, and the camping trips got harder to coordinate. First we went twice a year, then once, then not at all. I missed it badly enough that eventually I just went alone. I'd done it 3 or 4 times by the time this happened. Solo camping is a different thing than camping with friends, quieter, slower, more internal. You notice more because you have no one to talk to. You cook one meal instead of a whole communal spread. You sit with the fire in the dark and your own thoughts for hours at a time. I loved it. The spot I used was the same one from college. I knew it well. It was a bit of a drive, and the last stretch of trail was easy to miss if you didn't know where to look, which was exactly why I liked it. Other than the few friends who'd been there with me over the years, almost no one knew about it. In 6 or 7 trips, I'd only run into another person there once. I got there in the early afternoon, set up my tent in the usual spot, hung my food, got a fire ring ready. The weather was clear and cool. There were a few hours of daylight left, and I was planning to use them. I was sitting by my gear when the man arrived. He came down the trail alone. Mid-30s, maybe. Jeans, trail runners, a small day pack that could not have held overnight gear. He had the look of someone who'd been outdoors before, comfortable in his body, easy with his footing, but nothing about his setup made sense for where he was. This spot wasn't on the way to anything. You didn't pass through it on your way somewhere better. You came here specifically because you'd chosen this place, and to camp here overnight, you needed equipment he clearly wasn't carrying. He set himself up on the far side of the clearing, maybe 60 feet from me, and sat down on a log. I gave him a wave. He gave me a nod. That was the extent of our interaction. I didn't think much of it. People make strange choices. Maybe he was just resting before heading back. Maybe the pack was more capable than it looked. I went back to what I was doing. Around 6 o'clock, I walked down toward the tree line to use my stove, and when I looked back across the clearing, the man was gone. I hadn't heard him leave. The log he'd been sitting on was empty, his section of the clearing undisturbed. I noticed it was already getting dark. 3 hours of hiking to get back to the trailhead minimum. I thought, strange but okay. I was happy to have the place to myself. I made my dinner, a freeze-dried meal, boiled water, nothing fancy but hot and filling, and ate it sitting by my tent. The last of the light faded while I was eating. I hung my lantern from the tent loop, watched the tree line go dark, thought about nothing in particular. The evening sounds of the forest settled in around me. I was tired from the hike and from a long week before it. I turned off the lantern sometime after 9 and got into my sleeping bag. The night was quiet. I fell asleep faster than I expected. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. There was no moon that I could see through the mesh of the tent ceiling, and I hadn't thought to check my watch before I dropped off. The forest was black. Absolutely black. Not the urban dark where there's always some ambient glow leaking in from somewhere. This was the full dark of a place with no electricity for miles, and I was hearing footsteps. They were unhurried, measured, the particular soft crunch of someone walking on packed earth and dry leaves, being careful about their weight. They came from the direction of the trail, moved into the clearing, and then stopped, somewhere on the other side of the clearing. I lay there for a moment, not moving, running through the obvious explanations. Animal. Deer moved through here all the time. The footfall pattern was wrong for a deer. Could be a person who'd gotten turned around on the trail in the dark, who'd seen my tent and was approaching to ask for directions or a light. Possible. But the footsteps had stopped. If someone needed help, they'd still be moving. I found my lantern in the dark by feel and turned it on. I unzipped the tent flap and looked out. He was standing exactly where I'd last seen him, 60 feet away, maybe. Hard to be precise in the dark, even with the lantern light reaching partway across the clearing. But it was him, same build, same posture, just standing there. My throat tightened. He was close enough that my lantern would have been fully visible to him. He'd had to have seen it come on. "Hey," I called out. "Are you okay?" No answer, no movement. I sat there in the opening of my tent, holding the lantern, watching him, and he watched me. Or didn't watch me. I still couldn't tell. And the night between us felt very large and very quiet. I had a small folding knife in my pack, one of those practical Swiss-type blades I'd carried camping for years and used mostly to cut paracord and open food bags. I reached back for it without taking my eyes off him. 15 minutes is not that long in a normal day. 15 minutes is a sitcom episode minus the commercials. It's the time it takes to shower and get dressed. When you are sitting in the dark entrance of a tent on a remote mountain with a stranger standing in the shadows 20 feet away and neither of you is saying anything, 15 minutes is a very long time. Then he turned and walked back toward the trail. He didn't run, didn't hurry, just turned and walked the same unhurried pace as before and disappeared into the tree line. After a few seconds, I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore. I sat there for a long time after that. The way he'd turned, the angle of it, the direction his feet had been pointing when they finally moved, told me clearly that for those 15 minutes, he had been facing me, not the forest, not the lake. Me, he had been watching me the whole time. I did not sleep again that night. I sat with my lantern on at the lowest setting and my knife in my hand, and I waited for morning with the kind of patience that has nothing voluntary about it. When the sun came up, I broke camp, hiked out, and drove home. I've replayed that night more times than I can count. I've tried on every explanation available. Sleepwalker. Someone having a mental health episode. A hiker who'd gotten disoriented and was too embarrassed or too far gone to respond. Someone who'd heard the same thing I had in the dark and froze. None of it quite fits. None of it accounts for the fact that he'd left hours before sunset and then come back in the deep dark of the night. None of it accounts for the stillness, the silence, the fact that he stayed and watched for 15 minutes after he knew I'd seen him. I've been back to that campsite once since then with a friend. It was fine. Beautiful, even. But I checked both sides of the clearing before I set up my tent. And I didn't sleep as well as I used to. I think about what was in that man's hand when he reached for it. I don't know what it was. I turned and ran before I could see. That is the only reason I am here to tell you this story, and it is also the reason I have never been able to fully close the door on that night. Because I don't know what was waiting for me in those woods, if I had stayed 1 second longer. This happened at a backcountry lake not far from where I lived. I'd been there 3 times before, and I liked it. The trail was short, just over a mile from the trailhead to the water, and the campsite on the near shore was open and flat and close enough to the forest edge to give you firewood without having to go far. I wasn't a serious hiker. I didn't push for extreme distances or difficult terrain. I just liked sleeping outside, liked the lake in the evening, liked waking up to the sound of water. I'd planned a long weekend, 3 nights, and I was on the 3rd day when this happened. That afternoon, I hiked back to my truck to grab my fishing rod and some extra food I'd left in the cab. The round trip took maybe an hour. When I got back to the campsite, there was a second tent set up down the shore. I hadn't passed anyone on the trail either direction. The trail was the only official access point to that section of the lake. There were no other roads. I stood at my campsite for a moment, looking at the tent, and felt the first faint whisper of something being off. Then I told myself there was probably a second trail I didn't know about, or someone had come through while I was changing at the truck and I just missed them, and I let it go. No one came out of the tent while I was setting up to fish. No one came out while I fished, which was a couple of hours. I glanced over at regular intervals out of a sort of low-grade curiosity more than anything else. The tent just sat there at the edge of the trees, zipped shut, completely still. The sun was going down when I packed up my rod. I went back to my spot and started gathering wood for the fire. That was when I saw the shadow. The forest ahead of my campsite was already dark at the tree line, the light coming from behind me now. Someone was standing just inside the trees. I could see the shape of them clearly enough, the outline of shoulders, the suggestion of a head, but the shadow in the distance blurred the details. I told myself it was the other camper, probably gathering their own wood. I started the fire. The fire caught well, and I settled into my chair, watching the light bounce off the lake, letting the day wind down. I was pleasantly tired and content, in the way you can only be at the end of a good day outside. I was half asleep in the chair when I heard footsteps, multiple sets of footsteps, coming from the forest. I sat up and turned toward the sound. 4 men came out of the trees in a loose cluster and walked directly toward my campsite. They were all roughly the same age, somewhere in their 30s or 40s, and they were all moving with a particular kind of purpose. Not aggressive, exactly, not yet, but direct. like they had decided something before they came out of the trees and were already past the decision-making part. I tried to be rational about it. 4 men, maybe they were the other campers' friends. Maybe they'd seen my fire and needed something, help, directions, a first aid kit. I sat up straighter and tried to read their expressions as they came into the firelight. They didn't say anything. 2 of them went straight past me, directly to my tent. They unzipped it without asking, without a word, and started going through my things. The other 2 came to where I was sitting and physically moved me. Not a shove exactly, but a directed, deliberate pressure, away from the fire and toward the tree line. I said something. I can't remember exactly what. Probably something very normal. Something like, "Hey, what are you doing?" The kind of thing you say when your brain is still a few seconds behind the situation. They didn't respond. I kept talking, kept trying to get any kind of acknowledgement, any engagement, any break in what was happening. Nothing. They kept moving me backward, step by step, away from the fire, away from the light, away from the campsite, into the dark. I looked back once. The 2 men at my tent were still going through everything methodically. I could see my gear being moved, sorted, taken. The fire was getting smaller behind me. Then I couldn't see the fire anymore. There is a particular quality to darkness when you've just come out of firelight. Your eyes haven't adjusted yet, and the dark around you is total. I couldn't see my own hands. I couldn't see the men beside me. I could only hear their footsteps and feel the occasional contact as they kept me moving. Then we stopped. I turned to face them. I don't know why exactly, some instinct toward facing what you can't see. And in that moment, one of the men reached for something. I couldn't see what it was. It was too dark, and he was too close. I ran. There is not much to describe about running in total darkness through unfamiliar forest. You don't see where you're going. You aim your body in the direction you last knew the trail to be, and you move as fast as you possibly can, and the trees come at you from directions you can't anticipate, and the ground is unpredictable under your feet, and none of that matters. None of it matters at all. I found the trail, I found the trailhead, I found my truck. I sat in my locked truck in the dark for a long time before I started the engine. Nobody came after me. No footsteps on the gravel lot, no shadows at the tree line. Just the night and the sound of my own breathing slowing down. I drove to the nearest town and called the police from a gas station. They went out that night, but by the time they arrived, the campsite had been cleared. My gear, most of it, was gone. The other tent was gone. There was no evidence of anyone having been there at all, other than my own fire pit, still warm. No leads, no arrests, no explanation ever came. I've tried to make sense of what those men wanted. Why come for a solo camper at a remote lake? What they were planning to do once they had me deep enough in the trees that no one could see or hear anything. What the man reached for in the dark before I ran. I don't let myself think about it for too long. What I know is that I ran exactly 1 moment before it would have been too late. And that 1 moment is the only reason I'm still here to tell you about it. I checked 3 times. I walked the whole perimeter of that campsite in the morning light. Checked the tree line in every direction. Looked for tracks in the soft earth near the water. Checked the brush at the edge of the clearing for any disturbance. I walked back to the trailhead to see if any vehicle had been parked there that wasn't mine. There was no one. There was no sign that anyone had been within a mile of that campsite during the night. And yet there was a cup of tea sitting on my camp table that had not been there when I went to sleep. Still warm. I want to be precise about what happened before that morning, so you understand exactly why this shook me the way it did. I'm not a nervous person. I've been camping alone since I was 19, long enough that the particular rhythms of it, the sounds a forest makes at night, the way wind moves through different kinds of trees, the noises that come from nothing more sinister than small animals going about their business in the dark, are familiar to me in the way that my own house is familiar. I don't startle easily out there. I sleep well. This trip was to a lake in the north of the country, a place I won't name because it's remote, and I'd like it to stay that way. Getting there required 4 hours of driving and 2 of hiking, and the route was not marked in any guide I'd ever found. I'd been shown it by a friend years ago, and I had returned to it several times because it was, as far as I had ever been able to determine, entirely mine. I had never once encountered another person there. I arrived in late afternoon, set up my tent on the flat ground near the water, and spent the evening doing exactly what you go to a place like that to do. I cooked a simple meal. I watched the light leave the water. I made myself a cup of tea from my small stove, just loose-leaf black tea in my camp mug, nothing elaborate, and drank it slowly while the stars came out. I finished the tea, rinsed my mug, and set it upside down on the folding camp table to dry. I do this every night. It is the last thing I do before I go to sleep, and I do it so consistently that it has become a kind of ritual, the upturned mug signaling that the evening is over. The mug was upturned when I got into my tent. I am absolutely certain of this. I thought about it in the morning, and I thought about it for weeks after, and I am certain I slept well, which is itself something I've thought about since. No disturbances, no sounds that pulled me up to the surface of sleep. I woke at my normal time, just after first light, and climbed out of the tent feeling rested. I stretched. I looked at the lake. I turned to get my stove to start the morning tea. The mug was sitting upright on the table, and there was tea in it, made properly the way I made it myself, not a tea bag. Loose leaf, steeped and strained, still faintly steaming in the cool morning air. I stood there for what was probably a long time. My brain went through its catalog of explanations with unusual speed, the way a brain does when it has understood something unsettling and is desperately trying to find a way out. Sleep deprivation hallucination. I'd slept fine. Sleepwalking. I don't sleepwalk, and I had no loose-leaf tea pre-prepared anywhere. An animal. No animal makes tea. Wind. Wind does not steep loose leaf into a proper mug. I touched the side of the mug. Warm, recently made, maybe within the last half hour. Someone had come into my camp while I was sleeping, made a cup of tea using my equipment and my supplies, drunk part of it, and left without waking me. Without leaving a track I could find. Without leaving any indication that they had ever been there. I searched the campsite as thoroughly as I have ever searched anything. I walked expanding circles from the tent. I checked the trail in both directions. I went all the way back to the trailhead. There was no other vehicle. There were no footprints I didn't recognize in the mud at the water's edge. There was nothing. I don't have an explanation for what happened that night. I've tried every rational approach to this story, and every one of them fails at some point. The warmth of the tea rules out anything I did myself the previous night and forgot about. The lack of any trace rules out a passing stranger. The remoteness of the location rules out casual passers-by. The absence of any disturbed sleep on my part rules out any encounter that would have woken me. What I'm left with is this. Someone or something came into my camp in the dark, in a remote wilderness location that barely anyone knows exists, while I was sleeping 8 feet away. They used my stove, my kettle, my tea. They drank some of what they made, and then they were gone, leaving no sign that they'd ever been there at all, except for a warm cup of tea sitting where only I should have known to put it. I have not been back to that lake. I still think about it in the evenings sometimes when I'm making tea at home, about what it means that someone was in my camp that night, about whether they had been watching me all evening as I sat by the water, about whether they were standing somewhere in those trees when I woke up and walked the perimeter, close enough to watch me search and finding nothing, about whether the lack of any tracks means it was something that doesn't leave them. I don't have answers. I don't think I ever will. But I made absolutely sure my mug was locked in my pack the night before I drove home. I've camped in dozens of places over the years, forests, mountains, deserts, lake shores. I've slept in places so remote that the nearest other human being was a half-day's drive away. In all of that time, across all of those nights, I can count on one hand the moments that made me feel genuinely, physically afraid. That night in the Arizona desert is one of them. My partner and I had been looking for somewhere completely isolated. We were city people who needed, periodically, to get so far from the city that we couldn't see or hear or smell or feel any trace of it. We'd done this before, found a spot on a map that had no name attached to it, driven out on unpaved roads until the pavement was a memory, and set up our tents in the kind of silence that people who live in cities never really know exists. The road we'd turned off was gravel, which we liked. The gravel meant it was used occasionally, maintained occasionally, but it wasn't anyone's main route to anywhere. You'd only come down a road like that if you were looking for something specific. In the late afternoon light, the desert stretched out on both sides of it in that endless, ancient way that makes you feel simultaneously insignificant and very awake. We found our spot about 6 miles from the main road. Flat ground, good sight lines in all directions, a cluster of desert shrubs to break the wind on one side. Perfect. We set up the tents side by side, parallel to the road, and spent the evening the way you're supposed to spend an evening in a place like that. Watching the sunset turn everything amber and then purple, and then a blue so deep it doesn't have a name, and then just sitting in the dark with the stars overhead and the absolute quiet all around. By the time we went to bed, the road had been empty for hours. We hadn't seen a vehicle since we'd turned off the main highway. The last light we'd seen that wasn't a star or a planet had been our own headlights on the drive-in. I fell asleep quickly. The desert gets cold fast once the sun goes down, and I was warm in my bag and tired in the good way that comes from a long day of driving and setting up camp. I don't know exactly what time it was when the sound of the car woke me. The gravel crunch was impossible to miss. That particular clatter of stone under tires, the way it carries across flat open land at night with nothing to absorb it. My eyes came open and I was immediately, completely awake. I lay there listening as the car came closer on the gravel road. Not an unusual thing for a road, even a remote one. Probably a local rancher, probably someone who knew the area, probably driving to or from somewhere entirely mundane. The sound slowed. The car was passing our campsite. Then it kept going, and then, maybe a quarter-mile down the road, it stopped. I heard the engine idling for a moment. Then the sound of wheels on gravel again, closer now, and after a few seconds the engine sound again, moving back the way it had come, passing our tents again. Then it stopped once more, just past us. And this time I heard the wheels crunching as the vehicle made a slow, deliberate turn, the kind of three-point turn you'd do if you wanted to reverse your direction of travel. And then the engine sound changed, and I could hear it coming back, and then it stopped, and everything went very quiet for 1 second, and then the tent walls turned white. I sat up. The headlights were aimed directly at our tents. Both tents, fully illuminated, the tent fabric glowing. I could see everything inside my own tent lit up in the cone of the light. Whoever was in that car could see our silhouettes through the tent walls as clearly as shadows against a lamp. I checked my watch. 2:14 in the morning. My partner was awake too. I could hear the small sounds of someone lying very still and not sleeping on the other side of the thin wall between our tents. Neither of us said anything. I don't know if not speaking was a strategy or just the instinct of prey that has been caught in the open. The car sat there, engine running, headlights on, aimed at us. 1 minute. 2. 5. I watched the illuminated wall of my tent and thought about what was sitting 40 feet away on the other side of it, and I tried to think clearly about what my options were. I had no phone signal. I'd check before bed as I always did in remote spots. The nearest people were 6 miles away at least, and there was exactly one road. If I needed to leave, I would have to drive past whatever was in that car. 10 minutes. I thought about getting out of the tent. I thought about calling out. I thought about the specific vulnerability of being in a nylon box with a light source, making me completely visible to someone I couldn't see, and I decided against all of it. My partner texted me. We were close enough to be in local Bluetooth range. Just 2 words. You awake? I sent back, yes. At some point, I'd lost precise track of the time. The engine note changed slightly and the light moved. I watched the tent wall go from fully bright to angled to dark as the headlights swung away. I heard the gravel crunch. The engine sound moved back down the road, away from us, getting smaller, and then the road was quiet again. I sat in the dark for a long time. We broke camp before sunrise. We didn't discuss it. We just both started moving when the sky began to lighten, packing fast and quiet, loading the car with the kind of efficiency that comes from wanting to be somewhere else as quickly as possible. We drove back to the main road without saying much. I've gone back over it many times. A lost driver, a local who was confused about the road, someone having a breakdown and looking for a flat spot to turn around. All possible. All failing to account for the 10+ minutes of just sitting there, engine running, lights aimed at the tents. There's one thing I think about the most. The car knew we were there before it turned around. It had passed us twice before it stopped and aimed the lights. Whoever was in that car had already seen the tents, already seen the two small glowing rectangles in the dark in the middle of the desert, before they turned around and came back and pointed their headlights at us. They came back on purpose. What they came back for is the question I still don't have an answer to. We still camp, we still seek out remote places, but I am more careful now about where I stop, and I always leave myself more than one way out. And if I hear gravel crunching at 2 in the morning, I'm not waiting to see what happens next.